Hey there! So for this video, I wanted to go ahead and teach you how to create something that bounces. Something that's like being tossed from a relative height and bounces against a floor. Something kind of like this basketball in the scene, which will start when I press on the space key. So you can see it bounces and then it changes its maximum height up to a certain value. By the end of this, you'll be able to change all these variables exactly to be however you want. You can change their speeds, the energy at which it bounces back at, and all that good stuff. Before we get into that though, let's go ahead and start a new Scratch file. And we'll start from the very beginning. And let's start on the right side here where we have our sketchpad. So we can draw this out. And let's say that we have our ground right about so. Oop, that can be straighter. Right about so. And we have our ball maybe right here. Now, when we have things in what's called parabolic trajectory, then they kind of follow an x direction and a y direction. And this is important because in the x direction, we want our ball to have an initial movement, and in the y direction we don't. But gravity that we need to figure out how we want to simulate, gravity only works in the y direction with our coordinate system set up like so. So gravity will, which we can do is green, gravity is only pulling things down. And so gravity is going to affect our ball's y direction movement, but it won't affect the x direction. So if we start out without any initial velocity in the y direction, the up and down motion, then it's going to slowly start falling. And we know that that happens when we think about just dropping a rock down to the ground. So it starts here, it falls a little way, and then a split second later it starts to fall faster and faster and faster until it hits that ground. But if we have our ball with an initial velocity, then that velocity won't change the whole way through. So if we give our ball an initial velocity in the x direction, then no matter where that ball ends up going, it will stay with that same x velocity the entire way throughout. So if this is kind of a map of our bounce, then at each one of these points, that x velocity is staying the same. What's changing is the y velocity, how fast it's moving up and down. As it gets closer and closer to the ground, gravity has been acting on it for longer, and so the acceleration up and down, or the acceleration downward, is increasing. But it's not changing its acceleration sideways. So if we map this out up and down, then we have no y velocity here, but we have a little bit here, and then a little bit more here, and then we have our most right as it hits the ground. And then our velocity, if that's what we're mapping out here, this is our velocity in the y direction in red. Our velocity, it's now moving upwards. So it's going to have an upwards direction. And that is going to slowly get smaller and smaller until it hits this top spot here, when it's 0 again. Now, if you're a physicist like I am, then you know that this is technically not correct. Right at the moment of impact, it'll have 0 velocity again because it changes directions from down to top. But we're going to say right before it hits, it's going to have the biggest downward velocity, and right after it hits, it will have the biggest upwards velocity as well. So that's going to be how we can kind of visualize this whole process as we think about creating our scene in Scratch. Now, Scratch Cat is nice, but let's go ahead and give ourselves a new sprite, one a little bit more realistic, like a basketball. And let's go ahead and give ourselves a new backdrop, like our basketball court. We can put our basketball in a spot that we think is a good starting spot. and in our scripts tab, then we can see that these values all update as the sprite updates as well. So you find a good spot for it that you like, and you can see that it brings it out for you. Now I'm going to create 2 of them, and you'll see why soon. Let's go ahead and make this 175. I'll make 2 of them later. Make it at minus 175 for nice numbers, and then y equal 250. So if I click on it, it'll go right there. Now I'm going to duplicate this a second time here, and I'm going to keep this one off to the side just so that we can reset things by clicking it. So if this ball ever goes off to the side and we have our big code right here, then we can always just click on this one and it'll reset back to the beginning for us. Now, a couple of things we're going to need. We know we're going to need gravity. So we need our gravity involved. So let's go ahead and make a variable for that. I like to start all of my variables with lowercase. And gravity affects everything. So if you're making a game with multiple falling objects, then you want gravity to be the same across all different sprites. So we're going to say for all sprites is going to be what this variable is applied to. And the first thing we're going to want to do once we start our process is we're going to set gravity to 0. So we've moved our ball to a new spot, we set gravity to 0. Now we want to make a new variable. This new variable is going to be for just this sprite. And that is going to be our velocity in the y direction. And then we can create a new variable for our velocity in the x direction. And these, because these are velocities for the ball, they're going to be for this sprite only, not for all sprites, just this sprite only. And then we want to set those values to be what we want them to be initially. So our initial x velocity, you can try this out. This is going to be where you can set your x direction speed, how fast you want it moving sideways. But I think 2 is going to be a nice place to start out with. And then we can set our y velocity. So if you want it to have an initial motion either up or down as well as sideways, then you can do that here. But I'm going to leave mine at 0 for now. Now we'll be adding another variable later, but for now let's go ahead and work with this. After we're done setting our variables, we want to start a new forever loop. Something that says, okay, every time we run through a frame of motion, let's do the following steps. The first thing we want to do is we go to our motion. We want to move our ball sideways. So we change our x direction by a certain number. And the number we're going to change it by is our x velocity. So we drag in our x velocity variable right into that box right there, that little bubble. Now the next thing we want to do, obviously, is to change our y direction. But we need to know how much to change it by first. And gravity is changing how much we're falling up or how much we're falling down or moving upwards. So we need to make sure we change our y velocity according to how gravity is changing. Now gravity in our variables should not be 0, because that's like 0 gravity, right? One thing, you can try a few values out. I think a good place to start is setting gravity to -1. Again, if you want it low gravity, you can make it smaller than that. If you want it high gravity, you can increase that number, make it -5 even. But we'll start with gravity -1. Now, what we want to do is we want to change our, not our x velocity, but our y velocity. Remember, the x velocity is unaffected by gravity because it's a perpendicular direction. So we're going to change our y velocity by how much? Gravity. So if gravity is set to -1, then we're going to change our y velocity by -1. So that means if our y velocity was 0 before, then now it's going to be -1. If it was -1 before, then it's going to be -2, etc., etc. Now that we've changed our y velocity, we can move our ball. So we can change our y direction by whatever our new y velocity is. That's what's nice about this forever loop, is we can let the computer do all the calculations for us. And so as the y velocity changes, it'll still follow the same repetition of code. So this makes it move sideways and makes it move down faster and faster. But we want to do something. We want it to detect when to bounce back up. So we need to tell it just when to do that. So we need to assign some sort of variable or number for where ground level is. So if we look at our scene here, and I move my mouse cursor onto about this white line, we can see right down here, it's plotting out where our y value is. Y is our up and down motion. So it's right around -115. So let's make a new variable. Let's call this one our minimum y, min y value. That we never want the ball to be below our minimum y value. Now because this is for the ball, it's going to be for this sprite only. Now at the beginning, we're going to want to set our minimum y value to be whatever you want it to be. I like bouncing off that white line on the court, so it'll be -115. And now, after we've changed our x, after we've changed our y, now we want to check, okay, if we are below that imaginary line, so we go to operators, and we're using the less than because we're checking if something is less than a certain number. If our y position, which we can find in the motion category, if our y position is less than our minimum y value, then we know that we want to bounce. But one key thing to note here, it's possible in Scratch that this gets triggered when our basketball ends up being right here instead of at the actual ground. It could be that it was right here before, and then in the next frame, after we try changing its y by a certain amount, in the next frame it could be below the ground. So we don't want to bounce below our imaginary line. So the first thing we need to do is we need to shoot it upwards. We need to move it immediately until it hits that ground. So we will set our y position to be our minimum y value. So if we detect that our ball is below the imaginary line at minimum y, then we're going to automatically move that ball straight up to that ground level. And then we need to change our bounce direction. It needs to be going from a downwards direction velocity to an upwards velocity for that y direction. So we need to set one of our variables. So we change our y velocity. We're going to set our y velocity to be its opposite. And how we do that in Scratch is we use our operators, and we use a times operator here. So we're going to say, take our y velocity and multiply it by -1. Now we're going to set our y velocity to be equal to whatever it was before times -1. This makes it go from whatever it was right before to be the opposite direction. So that y velocity is getting larger and larger in magnitude, but it's negative, dragging our ball down. And so we're going to make it positive by multiplying it by -1. So if we watch this happen, we can add an event here. We can say when the space key is pressed, let's see how it looks. We get this nice bouncing naturally kind of effect. It gets that nice parabolic motion. And this is why I kept this block off to the side, so we can reset it. Now I don't like seeing all of these variables here, so I'm going to get rid of some of them. And there, sure, we'll stick with those three. So let's press that space key again and watch at the height. Watch the height of the basketball. You can see that it always bounces up to the same spot again. And that's not very realistic. If you like it, great, roll with it. But if you want it to be a little more realistic, if you want it to bounce back up to almost the same height, then here's what we do. Say you want it to lose just a little bit of energy as it bounces back up. Let's say you only want it to bounce back up to 95% of the height that it was before the bounce. Then we need to take our -1 right here, and we need to make that a 95% as 95% in magnitude. So instead of -1, it'll be minus 0.95. So it's not quite what it was before, but this small change will actually make it seem much more realistic in the sense that you're losing that energy in each little bounce. Now from here, you can also go ahead and set a new if statement, checking for other things like if we hit the right edge of the screen, so if our X position is greater than 238, then do some other things. You can set other triggers in here as well, whatever you'd like to do. Go ahead and have some fun with this. Try changing gravity to a different amount, like -3, and see what happens when you hit that space key. Try changing your X velocity, Y velocity, and your minimum Y values. Once they get changed here, then they'll automatically be applied throughout the rest of your code as well. So good luck.